Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Welcome to Scary Stories. I'm your old pal Bigfoot, and I'm gonna let PQ Ribber and Henry Lee DOGMAN tell you about 2 hours worth of DOGMAN stories. But first, I have a very special story that we just received last night, and supposedly it happened the night before. Without any further ado, let's jump right to it, and it's called Government Shutdown DOGMAN. As told to Peter Bernard, read by your old pal Bigfoot. Dear Scary Stories, my wife and I had a horrifying experience with DOGMAN last night, and we decided to send you a version of it this morning. We got out of the situation without a scratch on either of us, but it could easily have ended very differently. We foolishly had decided to hike in the snow in a national park in Wisconsin. I'm not sure if I want to name them, since I don't want to seem as though I'm blaming them for this, since I'm not. But it's a national park on Lake Michigan, and it has a famous lighthouse. In fact, we were near that lighthouse when this all happened. To cut to the chase, in a quite literal fashion, my wife saw DOGMAN, or a DOGMAN. What exactly do I mean by that? I'm still wrapping my mind around it myself. This was not an upright walking canid, or I guess I'm trying to say that my first thought was that this is not a dog reared up on its hind legs. My first impression, and my wife agrees with me about this, was that it was a man-shaped being with a dog head. My wife was instantly scared and she screamed, which she's never done before in the wild. We once saw a bear and we almost got run over by a moose, but she's never screamed before. When she saw this black hairy animal man standing there about 300-400 feet away though, she says she got more frightened than she's ever been before in her life, and she couldn't control herself. The worst part of this was that the DOGMAN turned and looked right at us. That made my wife scream even more, and that thing took off running directly toward us. In the split second I watched it running, I saw that it ran like a man, but its legs were not those of a man. It seemed like it was running faster than any human could, and so we both took off, trying to escape the thing. I know I myself did not think we had a chance to survive, even though we must have gotten a 300-foot lead when the race started. We had passed a ranger station not more than 5 minutes back, maybe less, so we instinctively ran for that. When we got there, of course, nobody was there because of the government shutdown. We were both exhausted, so we hid in a garbage dumpster and tried to breathe as quietly as possible. We never heard the creature come near the dumpster, so after a while, I peeked out and the coast was clear. We made a beeline for our car, which was maybe 15 or 20 minutes away. Every single noise we heard made us jump, but we made it back without seeing the creature again. By this point, it was getting dark. Once in the car, my wife began to cry. She said we had to see if we could report the sighting to somebody. I told her she should tweet about it because nobody was going to be on duty anywhere. She reminded me that she used to date a park ranger and that he didn't live too far away. Now, I just wanted to go home and be safe and take a bath. I didn't want to be out driving and talking about that monster anymore. I wanted to forget about it. And on top of all that, I most certainly did not want to be paying any social calls on any of my wife's ex-boyfriends. So there I found myself, a little while later, making the turn down the long, lonely road that her weirdo ranger ex-boyfriend lives on. There are only 3 houses on the whole block, all down at the end, and I can never remember which one is his. So I slowed down the car and rolled down my window to ask a guy I saw leaning against a tree in the dark. I called out to the guy, and he turned around. Except, it was not a guy. I mean, not a man. If it wasn't the same Dogman from before, it was his twin cousin. He charged our car, and I hit the gas, driving down the road, through the backyard of whoever's house was on the end, and across a big field toward a road that I knew led back to the highway. And the whole time, I could still see that dog-headed man chasing us, receding into the distance. My wife still wants to report this story to the authorities, but I said it would only make us look crazy. So, we agreed to tell the story to you anonymously as a compromise. My wife wants to add a plea to any governmental people who might be listening to please put the park rangers back to work. It's not safe out there without them. Thank you for your time. From Wisconsin, USA. Dogman by the Castle, as told to Peter Bernard. Back in the early 1970s, I had an aunt who dated an eccentric doctor. Visiting the castle on the beach that strange surgeon lived in almost cost me my life when I met the Dogman by the Castle. The 1970s, especially the early part, were unlike any period of time before or since. The counterculture of the 1960s became mainstream suburban culture in many ways by then. Shag rugs in sunken living rooms, straight normal guys growing their hair longer. 2 of the Yankees traded wives. And into this milieu, my aunt, let's call her Aunt Mallory, who had been very straight and proper, started dating this wild, swinging, and very rich surgeon. We didn't expect it to last long, but she and he actually became formal girlfriend and boyfriend, and our family got invited out to the castle to meet the guy. He reminded me of Vincent Price. He was African American, yet he still reminded me of Vincent Price. Maybe it was the smoking jacket and the cigarette holder for his French smokes. He also had a lion as a pet that he kept on a chain. Who would do that? This guy, that's who. I felt really bad for the cat, but I felt more scared of it than bad for it. It looked pretty cranky, as you can imagine. And so my sister and I got out of there as soon as we could and said we were going to wander on the beach. The doctor told us to stay out of the forest. There are wild beasties out there, he assured us. We rolled our eyes and of course made a beeline for the forest next to the beach. It was our obligation as kids to do so. We didn't realize until we were right up on them, but there was a sandy cliff about twice our height we'd need to climb in order to get up onto the level that the forest was on. We headed to the shortest point and started climbing. It was slow going and we both fell back a few times, as the hill was all sand and broke away at the touch. My sister noticed a rope someone had left hanging from the upper level, and we used that to climb up instead. We both attempted to make mental notes of where that rope was when we headed off into the trees aimlessly, looking for the proverbial adventure and whatever comes our way. We got that, and we got more. After racing around for a while and enjoying ourselves and the freedom from boring adults, we came upon something really strange. It was a footprint, but not like a normal footprint. For one thing, this guy had no shoes on. For the second, he seemed to have clawed toes. As my mind spun in circles trying to comprehend what we were looking at, my sister decided it had to be a bear or maybe a very large wolf. Suddenly I could see what she was saying. That made more sense than a barefoot man with claws. We followed the trail through the soft muddy dirt for some time, fascinated. The animal seemed to mainly walk on the balls of its feet, but occasionally would rest on its haunches and leave prints that looked a lot like a giant human print. The thing about that is that it would seem to indicate that it was squatting on its back legs but tilted up. Maybe it was walking bipedally too, That would mean it would have to be a bear unless it was a reincarnated prehistoric giant sloth like we had seen at the museum. This was turning into the best day ever. We followed the tracks until we reached a cave with an entrance large enough that we could walk through standing up. The footprints became jumbled at the cave entrance. Clearly this location was entered and exited a lot lately, and by more than one creature most likely. We found the home of the thing, whatever it was. Now why this next part made sense to us, neither my sister nor I will ever know, but we decided it would be a brilliant idea to go in the cave, find a good place to hide and observe, and then discover whatever this creature was. That's right, we decided to go in the cave, where we knew strange creatures lived, and try to spy on them. Maybe we thought we could get on In Search Of with Mr. Spock or something. We had no sense at all that we might be entering into a dangerous situation in any way. We'd seen enough Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom episodes to be able to handle ourselves in the wild, we thought. So, we walked into the cave, as quiet as two dumb kids can, and the ground is hard in there. We don't see footprints anymore. It gets dark pretty quick. The smell is terrible, like a whole lot of things died in there. There's a passage where we had to scrunch down and crawl and go slow to get through. If it sounds like we were walking into a death trap, there's a good reason for that. The tunnel opened up into a larger alleyway with tall stones shooting up from the ground everywhere. We heard echoing noises, and following them led us to the edge of a chasm, a large stadium-sized amphitheater under the ground. And down there, here and there, darting about in the darkness, we could make out very large, very fast men. This was the first moment I felt fear. The scene reminded me of Planet of the Apes in some way, or maybe the first sequel. We were in a place that wasn't even supposed to be, with creatures that weren't supposed to exist. "What are they?" my sister whispered. "They're scary," I whispered back. We mutually decided to get out of there while we could, which as it turned out was a time that had already passed. When we got near the passage that we had to scrunch to get through, there were creatures coming out of them. We quickly hid behind the stalagmites growing up all around. One after another, these man-sized things crawled into the cave and left into the larger chamber. We wanted to get a good look at them, and now our wish was being granted. The trouble was, they were also blocking our escape and probably going to eat us for dinner. The things crawling through the holes were in fact dogs. They moved gracefully on all fours, then simply got up on their hind legs after exiting the tunnel and exited to the left in one graceful movement. They were equally comfortable on 2 legs or 4. I'm not really sure what was going on. Maybe they were returning from a hunt. If so, they didn't seem to be bringing any food back with them. Even so, they smelled like death and I wanted to vomit. It was a few minutes after they were gone before I got up the nerve to go look in the tunnel and see if the coast was clear. As I got within 10 feet of the hole, I could hear something coming out, and I just barely got behind a stalagmite in time. I was now standing behind a stone, literally 2 or 3 feet from the thing that emerged from the tunnel. I could hear that there was another one coming through now, and another and another. I was crying, but I was trying hard not to make any noise or even breathe out loud. 2 of the creatures got into some kind of argument behind me, and one slammed the other into the rock I was hiding behind. I just held on as pebbles and dust fell from the cave roof on me. I was worried there might be a cave-in when a brand new problem rose its ugly head. All the dust raining on me had made me feel like I had to sneeze. Have you ever suppressed a sneeze? It's not easy to do, is it? Have you ever tried to suppress a sneeze with 2 man-sized werewolf monsters having a fist fight directly behind you? That's even harder. But I did it anyway. I suppressed the sneeze. The creatures eventually took their troubles to the larger cavern, and I finally had a few seconds to go into a mild state of shock for a while. It seemed long overdue when the moment arrived, I assure you. I don't know how much time passed, but suddenly my sister was there to my left, dragging me by my arm and saying the coast was clear. I couldn't really follow what she was saying. I was not fully back to reality yet. As I was midway through the tunnel, crawling on my hands and knees, I woke up and realized where I was. That was bad timing. I was now frozen, unable to move, and weeping all over again. My sister was already out of the tunnel, and she looked back to see me crying. She urged me to get out. She told me we had to go. Nothing worked. I told her I couldn't move. Then, from behind me, I heard a roar. The next thing I remember, we were back at the rope at the edge of the forest, leaping off the edge and jumping the 7 or 8 feet back down to the beach before running back to the relative safety of the crazy mad doctor and the castle and his pet lion. Like a lot of people in that era, we had an adventure and we kept the details to ourselves. We never told our parents, we never told our friends, and after a while it seemed harder and harder to believe that it could have even happened. If there were really that many monster creatures with dog heads running all around, surely they wouldn't get reported in the newspaper. Surely there would be one in the zoo or a stuffed one in a museum. How could a whole bunch of carnivorous man-sized predators live so close to civilization and not be something that everyone was aware of? It's literally just not possible. And yet, this is the true story of the time I nearly got killed in Dogman Cave.
The Dog-Headed Man of the Woods, as told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ Ribber. I grew up in my grandmother's home. I never knew my real parents. Grandma lived near the woods just outside of a town, and she was very old-fashioned, although it took me a long time to figure that out. We had no real neighbors, and she homeschooled me until I was 13. So I didn't know much about life except what she told me about it. And Grandma's world was full of such creatures as fairies, puckwudgies, Bigfoot, hide-behinds, and dogmen. When I was a kid, we heard a lot of noises coming from the woods. I would look to Grandma, and she would tell me a little story to explain the origin of each sound. Sometimes we would hear wood knocking, and Grandma would tell me it was the wild man of the woods communicating long distance. She said, when I heard that, I better get inside and lock the doors because those tree knockers might be talking to each other about me. Sometimes we would hear a speech outside our windows at night, and I couldn't understand what was being said. If the voices were high-pitched, she told me they were fairies, and if they were deeper, more guttural voices, she told me it was the trolls or the hide-behinds, who were both hairy men, but from different tribes than the hairy men of the woods who did the tree knocking. One night, we both heard a noise that sounded like the wind itself calling my first name. Grandma looked utterly terrified, which upset me. She never looked nervous about any of these creatures as long as we were inside and had our doors locked, but whoever was calling my name outside the house that night genuinely frightened my grandmother. I asked what it was, and she at first said she didn't know. She grabbed my hand and we went upstairs to her bedroom, locking the doors and windows and pulling the shades. She told me to stay the night in that room with her, and no matter what happened, to not look out any of the windows. After Grandma was asleep, I heard a tapping on my window just to my right. This terrified me because that window was 25 feet off the ground. I didn't get up, and I didn't look, not even after whatever it was started calling my name again from right outside that thin pane of glass. I pulled the blankets up over my head, stuck my fingers in my ears, and hummed until it finally stopped, and I fell asleep. Over breakfast, Grandma told me that it might have been a puckwudgie, since they will lure you to your doom. It also might have been a skinwalker or evil magician from one of the native peoples. Might have been a ghost too, she said. Sometimes ghosts get hungry, and they try to lure you out of your home and eat your soul. And again, maybe it was just a crazy stranger, I thought, but Grandma never mentioned that possibility. Everything in Grandma's world had a magical or supernatural explanation. And so, when we heard dogs howling in the night, they were only rarely coyotes or wolves. More often, they were the dog-headed man of the woods. She would never look frightened when we heard them, but she would lock the house up and we'd spend the rest of the evening upstairs on nights when the dog-headed men were on the hunt. Sometimes, on those nights, we heard horrible sounds that Grandma wouldn't explain to me. I could only imagine what had fallen prey to the dogmen that time. Grandma said that both the dog-headed men and the hairy men were tribes of other kinds of humans. They didn't like us but respected our boundaries as long as they felt we respected theirs. If we were found wandering on their turf, that very well could be the end of us. As long as we were locked in our homes while they were hunting or bringing their young through the area, they would usually tolerate our presence. The things that knew your name, though, those entities made Grandma genuinely uneasy. I don't think she understood what they were or what their intentions or capabilities were, although she tried her best not to let me know that at the time. So I grew up, went away to college, where I learned that not only were most people not familiar with dogmen and monsters that hovered outside second-story windows calling your name all night, but they didn't even believe such things existed. And you know what? They didn't exist, at least not at the dorms I was staying in. The big world outside was a lot brighter and more fun than living inside the dark, haunted forest of my grandmother's vivid imagination. I found myself, when I thought back on events from my childhood, rationalizing them and explaining them away as different and more normal things. Maybe the sound calling my name was an owl, or a hole in a fence that the wind was blowing through. Maybe it only seemed to be saying my name. Maybe our imagination filled in the blanks. Maybe the tree knocks were natural branch breaks or trees tipping over in the wind. Maybe they were deer hitting their antlers on branches. Everything that had happened before high school now seemed a lot more mundane to me, and this made me glad at the time. It felt a lot less stressful to only have to figure out how to get along with the human species and not to worry so much about Grandma's extended menagerie of intelligent hominids. So, Grandma died, and she left the house to me. I never went back, and I never put it up for sale. I didn't want to think about it or deal with it. Then I went through a rough patch in my adult life, both at work and with my significant other. I needed a break from both, so I decided to finally go out and check on the house. I could clean the place up and try to not think for a little while. When I got to the old house, the nostalgia was intense and almost overwhelming. It felt like someone put 2 backpacks on my back at once. I realized that it was my responsibility that I was avoiding by not coming to this place. My responsibility to wrap up the loose ends of the life my grandmother, who had raised me as her own and gotten nothing in return for it but to be left to die alone. It was responsibility and guilt I was hiding from. So, like a worker who hates his job, heading back to the grind on Monday morning, I trudged inside and rummaged around for the mop and the broom. No vacuum cleaner, of course, as Grandma had never had electricity run out to the house here. I wondered if there were cell reception and checked my phone. It looked like I was getting a little, but there was no Wi-Fi in the area. I tried a mobile hotspot, but it kept jamming halfway into loading. Coming to this place really was like stepping back in time. Suddenly, a loud wood knock broke me from my reverie. I stood up at once and wanted to run outside, but I laughed at myself. There would be nothing to see. That had taken place somewhere in the forest. I felt excited with every part of my body and spirit to hear that sound again. Some people tell me about nostalgia for seeing an old TV show or movie from their childhood, and I can't really relate since we didn't have a TV set, but suddenly, hearing that tree knock, I felt like this was the same thing for me as nostalgia for Saturday morning cartoons might be for a city kid. I felt very grateful to have experienced that and said a brief internal prayer of thanks. Something whispered my name. Something outside the window whispered my name. Then it did it again. Could that be an owl? Could that be the wind blowing through a hole in a tree? This only happened one time in my childhood, so why would it by chance happen a second time so many years later on the first night I came back to visit? I heard my name being whispered again, so I opened the window and looked out. I saw nothing, just the back area of the house and the forest past it. Still, this was my chance to find out what around here makes a sound so close to my name, a thing I'd been wondering about my entire life. So I got dressed quickly and ran downstairs and out the back. I just stood there and looked around. I could only hear a breeze. Couldn't hear any animals, and I couldn't hear any crickets. That was strange, not to hear crickets in the forest at night. Then I heard it again. I heard my name being called in that exact same voice from my childhood. It definitely came from my right, from within the forest, so I took off in that direction, running as fast as I could. There was something there. I saw the shadow of something standing behind a tree, and I ran directly toward that figure. I no longer heard anyone calling my name. As I got within 5 or 10 feet of the tree, the shadowy figure stepped out into full view. I looked up and saw its massive, muscular, hairy thighs. I looked higher and saw its belly, covered in lighter fur than the legs. Looking up further, there was the chest of a young Arnold Schwarzenegger, blown up to even more giant proportions and covered in dark, thick fur. On top of this massive chest was the head of a very angry-looking dog. It was the dog-headed man of the woods. It had arms on it that looked like they could crush a Buick LeSabre. Not front legs, but arms. It was a hairy man with a dog head. I fainted like a little girl. I'm not proud to admit it, but that might have saved my life. If this creature is anything like a bear, maybe playing dead was really the best thing I could have done. All I know is I woke up at the first rays of dawn sunlight with a headache and smelling an ammonia smell everywhere. It took me a while to comprehend that I was laying on the dirt outside, and a bit longer to understand that the ammonia smell was coming from me. The memory of the dog-headed giant flooded back to me quickly, and I ran back inside the house immediately. I knew in my head that the creature must have left hours ago, but I found myself shaking all over as though the incident were still going on. This thing I saw was much larger than the normal description I've been finding online about dogmen or werewolves. This was like the Hulk in the recent Marvel Comics movies, whereas the normal Dogman report is more of a creature like the Lou Ferrigno version of the Hulk. This thing really seemed like a special effects creation more than a natural animal. I think part of why I fainted was that even though my grandmother told me over and over that these things exist, the actual appearance of it was so over the top and so more than natural that my mind couldn't wrap itself around the existence of this monstrosity. All I know is I had left that house alone for too long. It was a few years. Not only did the creatures around here no longer remember my smell, they had probably forgotten about my grandmother by now as well. They had all reclaimed the house as their turf, and it would be too dangerous for anyone to stay there any longer. The newer generations of the various creatures might not respect Grandma's old turf. They might even come inside uninvited. No, it's too dangerous a place now. That forest is haunted. I'm in negotiations with a nearby wildlife preserve to annex my property, but there's swampland in between us that we're trying to purchase and include in the deal. I told this story to a city friend of mine, and they insisted that the monsters of the woods were all creations of my grandmother's and my imagination. I said, so what? By this point, they're fully real. I don't know if those things were always there, or if Grandma invented them, but either way, that cabin now belongs to DOGMAN.
Do you have a scary story you want us to read on the show? Just call our voicemail hotline, 804-LIST-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. And now for something completely scary.
Dogman in the Root Cellar, as told to Peter Bernard. My family moved every 3 or 4 years when I was a little kid, depending on where my father could find work. When I was 11 to 13, we rented a very old house on the outskirts of town. School was in town and within walking distance, plus we were surrounded by woods and friends of our own age. My sister and I both remember this as the most fun time of our childhood. Now, this was back in the 1950s, but the house we lived in was old, even to us back then. It had been a small family farm earlier on, as in maybe 10 years earlier. A freshwater stream ran through the back and we had a well and a root cellar. The root cellar was built into a nearby hill. It was basically a small cave with a door on it, all inside a little hill. Inside we kept stuff that we wanted to keep cool and dry. My mother would buy food in bulk and store it there because shopping was a bit of a hassle for us without our own car. So we'd get a load of potatoes or rice or whatever delivered into the root cellar, that sort of thing. I used to love the root cellar because it seemed like the house of an elf or a fairy or something. It seemed pre-human, like it had always been there. So, one day we were playing outside and my mom called out to tell us dinner was going to be late and we could play a little longer. It had just started to get a little dark and a little scary too. We were just 2 kids, me 11 and her 9, and we were alone with a very large and living forest around us with trees reaching up far into the sky. We usually weren't allowed out this late, so that added to the excitement. We couldn't waste this opportunity. We decided to tell ghost stories to each other in the encroaching darkness, but neither of us could remember how any of them went, and we utterly failed at scaring each other in the slightest. So then my sister started challenging me, asking me if I was brave enough to go sit in the root cellar alone in the darkness. I challenged her back. She told me it was probably haunted in there and a ghost would reach out and touch me. I told her spiders would crawl up her back and I saw her expression crack. Ghosts were theoretically scary, but spiders were definitely scary, especially to little sisters. So she said if I could sit there for a minute, that she would go second and we had a deal. I thought we should have a word to shout out in case we needed the door open in an emergency. I was untying the rope, holding the doors shut as we were finalizing the details of our agreement with each other regarding our bet about sitting alone in the dark in the root cellar when BAM! The doors of the cellar burst open from the inside and knocked me and my sister both backward onto our butts. My sister screamed and I possibly might have as well. What had come out of the cellar? Looking behind us, we saw, running away at unfathomable speed, the big bad wolf from the Three Little Pigs cartoon. I mean, it was not a cartoon. It was a tall, hairy man monster with a dog's or wolf's head and a very long snout with very tall ears racing away on its hind legs like a man. I believe it had a tail. It was not clothed. The fur was dark brown or black. It was hard to tell in the twilight. My sister and I ran in the house and cried to our mother about what happened. She ordered us to go back out and lock up the root cellar, but we cried and refused, saying there was a wolfman out there. She went and did it herself, then came in and gave both of us fairly harsh spankings for causing extra work for her, then sent us to bed without dinner. How had the thing gotten into the shelter if the door was tied shut from the outside? The shelter did not lead to a cave system or anything. It was a hole in a rock in the ground that someone put a door on. It had no tunnels leading off or other rooms inside. How could this werewolf man have gotten in there? It remains one of the great mysteries of my life. Whenever things start to seem mundane, I think back on the time I got knocked on my butt as my root cellar got evacuated by DOGMAN.
DOGMAN in the Basement, as told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ Ribber. When I was much younger, around 19 or 20, I used to work with a friend of mine for his father's handyman fix-it company. We were way out in the boonies, and it was the 70s, so we were the only people available to fix a range of things, from drains to sidewalks to fences, and, unfortunately for us, even septic tanks. These days, no matter how far you're away from civilization, you can call in professionals for each of these jobs. But in the country in the 1970s, it was still a little bit like the Wild West. There was a time when digital items were only starting to be made. Most of what existed was still mechanical and analog. You could glue it back together. You could solder it. You could cover it with bricks and concrete. That's how we saw the world back then, even if your problem was DOGMAN. So let's jump straight into what happened. We got called out to patch up a hole in a basement that they said rats chewed through. When we got there, we were more than a little surprised to see a 4-foot by 4-foot hole torn out of the wall, which led to a natural cavern system that I just peeked my head inside to look at. It must have stretched under the entire neighborhood at least. Who knows where it led? As I went back into the basement, I couldn't understand how the rats even knew to dig here. There was no obvious clue that on the other side of the rock stood a house. As I looked closely at the sides of the hole, I saw long scrapes made at somewhat even distances, as though the hole had been dug out by Wolverine from the X-Men with his adamantium claws. If this was done by rats, they must have been giant rats. We got ready to brick up the hole, making it thicker and harder to penetrate than it had been originally. Eventually, we took a break, and the teenage daughter of the family brought us some lemonade to drink. She was really pretty, and around my age at the time, so I started talking her up, and she seemed interested. After a bit of chatting, I asked her outright what the real deal was with the hole in the basement. I told her I could tell it wasn't dug by rats, so who or what did it? I was thinking it was burglars, possibly, or homeless people, but if so, then why was the family saying rats? She looked around to make sure Mom wasn't within hearing distance, then told me it was werewolves. Me and my buddy laughed so hard that we almost fell on our butts. She got really angry because she was serious. She said they were as tall as a tall man and they had dog heads. I was thinking, what a shame that such a pretty girl was so bonkers. This was the 1970s, remember? Werewolves were on Creature Features and on Chiller Theater, but not in people's basements. And I'd never heard of DOGMAN. I don't think I heard about him till the 90s or at least the late 80s, so I was not considering at all that this might be a real thing she was telling me. I was just trying to decide if she was joking, or crazy, or lying, or simple, or what. I decided to be reassuring, in case she was a total nut job. Well, don't you worry your pretty little head about it, I told her. My buddy and I are going to lock those werewolves down in that cave for good. She just looked at us like we were idiots and told us blandly that we weren't locking them down there. We were locking them up here. I sort of chuckled, but it was half-hearted. I looked at my buddy, and he wasn't laughing at all. For some reason, a chill went through me, and I got back to work. By the time we were done, it was getting dark. The mother inspected our work and paid us on the spot, including a few bucks tip. We sat in the car for a few minutes, splitting up the cash, when I heard a howl. I asked my buddy if he heard that, but he was still counting dollars out loud, so obviously he hadn't. I asked him to be quiet, and he gave me an annoyed side glance. That's when we both heard it. My buddy was in the driver's seat, and he was cursing up a storm. He could see something in the rearview mirror. I turned around in my seat and strained my eyes in that weird light that exists just before things go completely dark. I swear, at first I thought I was looking at a man in a bunny rabbit suit. That really frightened me, by the way. I wasn't laughing like it was cosplay because we didn't have cosplay or furries yet as far as I know. I was thinking serial killer, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre or something, but the thing moved so fast and so gracefully. It was like a living thing, not a man in a clumsy costume and mask. It darted to the entrance of the house's basement, and for a split second, I could make it out fairly well illuminated by the house lights. If you've ever seen an Afghan hound, that's what this reminded me of. It had a long nose and long blonde hair like a rock star, but everywhere on its body. It was stunning to see, an unforgettable sight. Its arms were thicker than most dogs' front legs, and they seemed to end in fists, not paws. People ask if the back legs were more like a dog's or more like a man's, and I would have to say it was sort of like a man if he were able to run very quickly and gracefully on the balls of his feet. The length of the ball of the foot to the heel was longer than in a human. Like I said, though, I only saw it illuminated for a split second, and it was slowing down to run downstairs into the open basement. Very quickly, he was followed by another one that looked just like him, but was mostly black in color. Once those things saw that we had blocked up their hole, they were going to come out of that basement twice as fast as they went in and 10 times as angry. I started hitting my buddy on the arm, saying, "Drive, drive," and drive he did. We didn't speak on the way home. We were too busy making sure nothing was following us. When we got back, we both insisted to my friend's dad that he should mark that place on the no-go list. He asked why, if they'd paid in full. Neither of us wanted to say it was because that neighborhood was infested with ferocious, probably carnivorous, man-sized bipedal dogs who could run as fast as a gazelle. My buddy just looked his dad in the eye and said, "We made our suggestion. You can do what you want. It's your business. But as far as the two of us go, that whole area is on our personal no-go list." His dad was cool with that. He got that something happened that was too personal to share, and he never asked us to go back to that place again. It illustrates how frightened I was of those dogmen or whatever they were that I never even tried to get a date with that girl. She seemed to like me, and I had her phone number. You have to understand, back then, I would go through any danger to get a date. Once, this other girl's father told me to my face that he would break my kneecaps with a baseball bat if I ever even said hello to his daughter. I went on to date her for 3 months. I dated another girl with a violent ex-boyfriend who still viewed her as his turf and property. When I was in my late teens and early 20s, I regularly and literally risked my life to get to spend time with girls, yet I never once considered contacting the girl who lived in Dogman's neighborhood. I don't think I'm a coward, but there's a number of things I've been terrified of in my life. It goes from small things like spiders and then scorpions up to snakes and alligators and bears. I have a fear of armed men wearing masks. But then, there's that kind of fear I can only call dread. It's all those other fears of being hurt or losing your life added to the gut feeling that something is going on here that is just wrong. It's not just bad for you. It's a terrifying development that this could even happen. What if my buddy's car hadn't started right away? What if we had still been there when those things came back up out of the basement in a rage? I still have repeating nightmares of this. We were extremely lucky that what happened to us was only a sighting and nothing more. To me, it felt then and still feels now like we had a near miss with something extremely horrible. Even thinking about the Dogman makes me sad. Why does evil have to exist along with good? Why do these creatures have to spend their lives skulking and sneaking through the darkness, bringing fear and presumably death wherever they go? I guess our modern world is naive that we can create a world where everyone is happy and satisfied and works toward the general good. The world is both yin and yang. So for every noble creature born on earth, there must also be born something foul and evil and wrong, like Dogman.
The Dogman of Van Cortlandt Park. When I was much younger, about 5 or 10 years ago, I used to date a girl that lived behind Van Cortlandt Park. One night after walking her home, I saw a dogman in the forest behind her house. This was long before I had ever heard of such a thing as a dogman, and so I did something very foolish that nearly cost me my life. Let me go back to the beginning. I don't need to tell you much about the girl I was dating, but when I met her in the city, I had her pegged for a Manhattan girl or Brooklyn possibly. We made casual friends right away, and the second time we ran into each other in a club, we got much closer. I wasn't just attracted to her, I was falling for her quickly, and before you knew it, I had a girlfriend that had to ride trains for 90 minutes to get home. That meant a lot of alone time in public for us, but it also meant incredibly tedious 90-minute rides back to civilization for me after the dates were over. I liked her a lot, but I don't like the suburbs, and technically I think this girl was officially 1 block into Yonkers, for crying out loud. I kinda made up my mind to give it a chance until the fall, then if we were still together, decide what to do then. I sort of enjoyed being alone walking back to the train on summer evenings, but I knew I was gonna really begin to dislike all the traveling once the weather got colder again. Maybe we'd get serious by then and she could move in with me in the city, or maybe we might want to move on from each other before the winter. So, to walk her home from the train, we'd have to walk a few blocks along the back of Van Cortlandt Park, which is a huge natural area that also includes a golf course and I forget what else. I think there's a cemetery there too, if I'm remembering correctly. So anyway, we'd walk down this long street for 4 or 5 blocks with the houses on the right side of the street that people lived in, and on the left side of the street was just jungle basically, forest, straight up to the edge of the tar, with a little 1-foot-tall metal fence marking the border between. I remember asking her if animals ever came across the road into people's yards, and she said yeah. Sometimes you'd see a squashed possum or a squirrel on the road. There were a few points where the trees had branches long enough that the squirrels could leap across the highway from one branch to another and make it across safely. Most of the time. I used to kid her when we were walking there on dark nights that the forest clearly held Sasquatch. I think I would tell her that it was very squatchy and try to get her scared. It never worked, but on those long walks back alone, I was certain I heard Bigfoot, serial killers, probably even Freddy Krueger back in that forest. It always sounded like someone was tailing me. In fact, it sounded so much that way every single time that I figured it had to be an echo or something like that. But when I would walk toward her house, the sound was definitely not there. I figured maybe it had to do with me being alone, that the echo might get canceled out if there were other sounds like talking. Still, my walks back got a little faster each time, as I could just not be certain of what I was hearing. Okay, so fast forward to me agreeing to go to a party up in her hood that doesn't start till late. That meant I'd have to be doing the perp walk back to the train at dawn, but whatever. summer party, meet new people, all that. So, on this occasion, I had to meet her at her door, actually meet her parents. Then they would drive us over to the party. I ended up getting along with her father well enough that he suggested we walk to the place alone. It's just 7 or 8 blocks, and it's such a nice night, he told us, and so, with her parents' blessing, off we went into the night. So we walked, and even though we were making chit-chat, I could hear that echo, which never really sounded at all like an echo. It sounded like something was walking through the brush alongside where we were walking. It would stop when we would stop, and it would go when we would go. The girl noticed the sounds and noticed me noticing them. This got her nervous. "Listen," she said to me seriously, "if that turns out to be like son of Sam Jr. or something in those woods, you've got to carry me." I was like, "What does that mean?" And she was like, "You need to pick me up and carry me because you know I can't run in these heels." It was true, she couldn't. Her parents wouldn't let her go out in a miniskirt, and they ended up agreeing on this pencil skirt thing that went down below her knees, and she ended up wiggling more than walking. How her dad saw that as less sexy, I'm not sure, but the louder that noise got in the woods, the more I wish that girl was wearing roller skates instead of heels. I heard branches breaking at heights much higher than mine, so I got the sense of it being very tall. Consequently, I stopped thinking this was a human stalker at all, and I relaxed a bit. I was thinking it might be a deer or a moose or something like that. I was from Manhattan. I didn't know that moose aren't supposed to run through Yonkers, so this made sense to me. Then, whatever it was, came out of the woods, and you know what? Just like moose, these things aren't supposed to be in Yonkers either. Picture a trick dog that walks on its back legs on a TV show, right? Now imagine this dog is like twice your size and half crazy from hunger. Dogs are cute when we're 5 times bigger than they are, but what about when the tables are turned? This dog looked like it would take a lot of Alpo to stop his stomach from rumbling. It took a step forward, and in that one step it was nearly already at the painted yellow lines in the middle of the road. I noticed when it took that step how sure-footed this creature was. We were not watching a stupid pet trick. We were watching a graceful, giant predator working its craft. The craft of hunting humans. "Call your father," I suggested strongly. She began fiddling with her phone nervously. I looked around desperately for anything I could use as a weapon. Just then, a loud beeping scared me, and apparently the dogman too, as it fled off in the forest somewhere. A car screeched to a halt, and the driver got half out of his front door, leaning up over his car hood and asking if we were okay. I said we were, thanks to him, asked if he could stick around for a minute, while my date called her father to have him come pick us up. He said sure, and she made her call. Then he sort of made comments to the effect that he had places to go. I reminded him of the giant dog-headed thing in the woods that he had just stopped to save us from, and for some reason that only seemed to make him even more eager to leave. Then we all heard it. A growling from the forest. Our rescuer fled the scene like in an old Keystone Cops black and white comedy. Now there was nothing between us and that dogman except some leaves, branches, and 2 lanes of blacktop. "Let's move," I said. "Carry me," she said. I grabbed her right hand with my left and pulled her away from there. She squealed and did her best to keep up as I heard the thing emerging from the trees. I knew it was on the road now. I knew it was coming toward us. I could hear it breathing. I could smell it now. It smelled like the entire zoo was walking toward us. I suppose, in a sense, that was true. Funny the weird things you think of as you're about to die. I could hear the creature just a few feet behind me, and I figured it was time for me to face my fate. Maybe I could keep him from getting the girl if nothing else. I turned, ready to fight for my life, and instantly realized how ridiculous the notion was. This was taller than a tall man, and it had claws like nothing I had ever seen. I guess they were claws like a bear, but they were shaped more like human hands. It had teeth like an alligator, I guess you could say. It did not look like it led a vegan lifestyle. It took a step forward, and I literally had to look up to continue to watch this proto-cave dog monster face drooling at me. Suddenly the dogman was illuminated from its right, and a car was speeding directly toward us. I backed up and so did the creature, and my girlfriend's father skidded and screeched into the picture. He shouted at us to get in and we sped off. I didn't see the creature reemerge from the woods as we left the scene. He claimed he hadn't seen anything, but he seemed as upset as we were, so I didn't really believe him. We didn't stay long at the party as we were both concerned with getting rides home. I wasn't ever interested in walking that girl home again alone. When I would visit her from then on, we would cab it. And since that ate into my vast fortunes, I gradually dated her less and less as we headed into the autumn months. We never had a big fight or a breakup. We had gone through a traumatic event together and it had changed us. Sometimes that makes two people bond together more strongly, and other times it changes them each in different ways so that they just naturally move on. And that is the true story of how I saw the Dogman of Van Cortlandt Park.
Dogman is a mental or holographic projection, as told to Peter Bernard, read by P.Q. Ribber. I am one of the very few people who have gotten to see something I could call Dogman, not once, but twice. The first time, I was convinced I had a close encounter with a predator and that I barely escaped with my life. The second time, I became convinced that Dogman is, in actuality, a mental or holographic projection from a lost high culture. I retired in my late 30s and have pursued my dream since then, which is to hike and camp a full 40% of my time. I alternate between vacations in luxury campers to genuinely extremely dangerous climbs and hikes. I've also gone camera hunting for various rare animals, and I know how hard it can be to get a clear picture of a predator in the wild. I never got a picture of a dogman, but I did get two pretty strange stories. Okay, so I was hiking the Greenstone Ridge Trail in the Isle Royale National Park with 3 buddies, and we heard something bellowing off in the distance. None of us heard anything like that before in our lives. One of my buddies started pointing, and out of the bushes in front of us runs this giant thing. I want to say it was like a Yeti or a Bigfoot. It was a monster covered in dark brown hair. It didn't have big human feet, and it didn't have a gorilla face like a Sasquatch, though. It just sort of looked like a standing, talking dog from a kid's nightmare. It had hands, and it ran on its hind legs. It was making a growling sound, and it had something in its mouth. I couldn't see what it was, and maybe I'm lucky I didn't see it. It shook its head violently, as though trying to throttle the life out of whatever was in its massive jaws. It gave off every bit of the energy of a killer. This was a carnivore, born to kill and eat everything in its path. All of what I'm describing occurred in a split second, and I'm not sure the animal was even aware of our presence. It ran off up the path and off into the distance without ever acknowledging us. We stood there dumbfounded, unsure of what we had just witnessed. One of my friends noticed it left tracks as it ran off, and for some reason we decided to follow them out of curiosity. They led up the side of a mountain, following a path and walking directly down the center of this dirt path the entire way. Then the tracks ended. They just ended. The creature could have dived off the side of the cliff, but there was nothing below for hundreds of feet, and we didn't see its corpse down there either. There was no place to leap up to either. There was no place to go down from where the last tracks occurred. Also, the last tracks looked the same as the tracks before it. They showed the animal was running, uninterrupted, just as it had for its entire track. It did not look like the animal jumped from this point. It just looked like the animal had run into oblivion. I stated that the ground must just be harder from this point on, and that surely we'd pick up the trail as we headed further upward. My buddies didn't really buy my theory, as we were all still leaving tracks even as we traveled further up. We never saw the dogmen again that day. Fast forward to 3 years later. I'm on the same trail with 3 entirely different friends. I've told none of them about what happened the last time I was in this location. In fact, I haven't even told any of them that I was ever here before. Our first night camping, we set up tents in a clearing. The entire night we were tormented by someone running through our camp, slapping our tents and running off. It was a stunning concept to us that someone hiking up here would waste his energy like that, running around, risking getting shot, tormenting other hikers. Where was the logic in this behavior? Even though I had gone back to this area hoping to see the Dogman again, it hadn't dawned on me yet that our tormentors might now be human. All of our second day hiking, I had that feeling of being watched. I could see nothing with my eyes as I looked around to support the vibe I was picking up, but I was increasingly certain through the day that whoever was bothering us the night before was now following us. I told as much to my fellow hikers, who told me they did not share my feeling of being watched. That night, however, we were once again plagued by someone running through the camp and slapping our tents. When we would look outside, we would see nothing out of place whatsoever. We became too concerned with this to sleep, so we built a big campfire and spent the rest of the night staring off into the dark, straining to see what was out there. The third day, I once again had that feeling that we weren't alone. After a few hours, I insisted I knew where our stalker was. I pointed to a patch of woods west of us, and I darted directly toward it. This is a very bad procedure on a hike like this, to fly off without the agreement of the others, especially when you might be running directly toward danger. It was a completely illogical thing for me to have done. I think that whatever was in the woods had become a bit of a Moby Dick to me due to my recent sleep deprivation. So there I was, screaming in anger and running toward a monster like I was Mel Gibson in the movie Braveheart. My fellow hikers ran after me, probably unsure what else to do. Then, the thing that had been stalking us, the thing that had been taunting us, the thing that hadn't been letting us sleep, stepped out from the forest. This was the most terrifying thing that has ever existed. This was like a dog version of Tyrannosaurus Rex. This was a 13 or 14 foot tall, prehistoric looking giant with massive claws on the ends of both its thick arms and tree trunk legs. It whipped its tail behind it like a weapon, and it roared. My friends and I turned tail and ran like a scene from a Monty Python movie. There was nothing graceful about our egress. We climbed over each other and through each other like frightened children. The extremely and impossibly large dog thing had put our conscious thinking minds to sleep and had awakened the primal, terrified, pre-lizard fight or flight parts of each of us, and we had succumbed to the lowest aspects of our fear-based ego selves. We would have gnawed through each other to get to safety. There was no humanity left in any of us. That is how effectively the dog monster man was in reducing us to nothing but fear. A scream went up behind me, and when I say up, I mean one of my friends got lifted in the air as he screamed. I tumbled behind some bushes and a large rock hiding and peeking out. What I saw was something from an old black and white Warren horror comic book. This thing with a head like a giant rat, mixed with a giant dog, mixed with a dinosaur, held one of my buddies who had lost consciousness about 5 feet off the ground and inches from its nauseating, drooling, and giant jaws. It was going to eat my friend. I grabbed some rocks and started throwing them at the thing and screaming anything to distract the dog monster from eating my friend. Then the other two joined me, and the strangest thing happened. something even stranger than this story has been so far. The animal blinked out. It turned off. It looked like someone just turned the TV set off. My unconscious friend slammed to the hard ground from 5 feet up where he had been being held. This woke him. We beat it out of there to the closest ranger station and cut the rest of our hike off. Fact. A variety of Dogman creatures are being reported by more and more people each year. Fact. These creatures can appear and disappear as though they are being projected from some other place. While here, they can leave physical traces like footprints. They can manipulate matter like when my friend got picked up. When they are turned off, it's as though they were never actually there. Fact. Dogman-type creatures have been reported by humans going back to before the dawn of civilization. Therefore, the technology which creates Dogman encounters must predate human civilization. Why was it created, and what exactly is it intended to guard? Is this technology still under conscious control, or has it been left to run in an automated way controlled by bots programmed before the dawn of human culture? What is the true nature and the true mission of the Dogman?
Dogman at the Comic-Con. This story takes place many moons ago when I was a young man around 22. In fact, I'll go so far as to say I was exactly 22. I only made it to 23 by sheer luck, though, after the day I came face to fangs with an actual, real-life, dog-headed humanoid. Okay, there was and is a comic convention that occurs in my area in a shopping mall located right next to a small woods that connects to a national forest. I don't want to mention the name or even the state I'm referring to since the Comic-Con still exists, and I don't want to make trouble for the owners by saying their con is haunted by monsters or anything. The following story took place outside the con in a forested area I probably was not allowed to be in, so all the responsibility for this falls directly on me and the girl I was seeing back in those days. This was a time when cosplay was only beginning to be a thing at cons. You wouldn't see that many people in costume, and usually they weren't as elaborate in those days. My girlfriend and I were just wearing jeans and sneakers, and she was one of the only females in the entire place. Anime was really only starting to hit America, although it would take over in less than 5 years. In those days, it was mainly about Star Trek, DC, Marvel, and old 60s nostalgia like Batman and Lost in Space. I think the headlining celebrity at the event was Gilligan Bob Denver, who told us a cool story about playing Maynard G. Krebs. He told us story after story, I think partially because my girlfriend was basically the only woman there. Or the only woman who knew who Maynard G. Krebs was, at least. So, Comic-Cons are fun, but after a while you need a break. We didn't want to leave, but we needed a break, so we bought ourselves some junk food for lunch and then snuck out the back where we weren't supposed to go and wandered off into the woods. We found a clearing with 2 logs in it that were convenient to sit on, and we just chilled for a while. I noticed my girlfriend did not seem as relaxed as I was, and that she seemed to be looking at something off in the distance. Then I heard something in the trees, and I started looking over there myself. Under my breath, I asked her if she knew what was over there. She said it was a really tall dude dressed all in black, and she wasn't sure, but she thought he might be wearing a mask. Now, to be clear, this figure my girlfriend wasn't 100% certain she had seen was not coming from the direction of the Comic-Con, and to reiterate, we didn't have the expectation of seeing costumed individuals the way we do now. This was some tall, dark figure coming from the forest, walking toward us and the convention. I began to pay closer attention, and our conversation ceased as we both tried to get a better look at whatever was out there. We never could, although we could hear it moving from the right of our field of view to our left, then back again. I'm not trying to say it was invisible, I just mean whoever it was had to have been behind the trees just out of our vision. After a while, my fear and concern turned to annoyance and a touch of anger. My girlfriend said we should go back to the con, but I was young and hot-headed, and I wanted this tall guy to know he had bothered me and my girl. So I got up, but instead of walking back to the con, I walked further into the forest, shouting loudly and dramatically to the figure to show himself and explain himself. For some reason, I was convinced by his lack of reply that I had scared him. Emboldened by this, and against the complaints of my then-girlfriend, I got louder and walked further into the forest, demanding the lurker show himself immediately. I'm not sure how far I walked, but I know I couldn't see my girlfriend behind me anymore. I tromped on and on, shouting rude things to the stalker dude and generally acting like a macho idiot, which I guess is what I was sometimes back then. Don't worry, I learned my lesson about that, and here's how. Satisfied that I had scared off the annoying peeping Tom, I turned to walk back to my girlfriend triumphantly. I had to walk through a narrow passage of trees at one point. As I entered, I shouted out to my girlfriend that I scared the jerk off, and I saw a figure at the other end of the alley of trees appear. I assumed it was her and kept talking to her about what I had seen. Then I heard my girlfriend call out my name. From far beyond the figure I saw in front of me. Studying the silhouette in more detail, I saw that this was not the silhouette of a woman, or even that of a human. It was far too tall, and its legs were all wrong. It looked like it had pointy ears on top of its head. This was not a person at all. This was something more like a werewolf. It was breathing heavily, and my first thought was that this is a movie set. Someone must be filming a movie at the Comic-Con, and I accidentally stumbled into their scene. I didn't see any cameras, but that didn't mean they weren't there. At that point, I heard a strange noise behind me. I thought at first of a motorboat engine, which made no sense since there was no water behind me. Turning around, I saw, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, another one of these creatures. It was a hairy monster with a dog sort of head, and I could see more details in this one. It was incredibly ugly. It definitely had the ears on top like a dog or bear or cat, but the face was not like anything I have ever seen. It had a kind of a dog face if it had been squashed down, but not like a pug dog. I'm not really sure how to explain it. Imagine if a dog's head were a cake, and imagine the cake deflated in places in the oven. It lacked symmetricality somehow. I was looking at it lit from behind, and all of this took place in maybe 3 seconds or 4. It had a mouth like a dog, but also like an ape. I guess a gorilla, as it was dark all over. Both its hair or fur and its skin underneath were ebony black. It was quite a striking and imposing creature, and it looked like it could tear me apart casually. I really am not sure of the size, but it was alarmingly large and tall. So now, I was looking back and forth, seeing identical monsters at either end of this narrow passage, and it didn't seem like my idea that I was on a movie set was really a valid theory any longer. The trees to my left and right were growing so closely together that it didn't look like I could pass through them. I did anyway. I found I could make better time than I thought I could, although the trees were ridiculously tightly packed for the entire beginning of my little adventure. I wanted to run for a while, then turn left and hope I came out somewhere close to the clearing or the Comic-Con. I wanted to get to safety and get my girlfriend out of danger as well, but the main priority at the moment was to not get torn into pieces by those 2 tall fellows behind me. So it was painful going as I got torn up by thorns and banged my head pretty hard on a branch because I was idiotically looking behind myself as I walked. But I was feeling out of danger as I turned left and headed back in what I hoped would be the direction of the clearing I last saw my girlfriend at. The trees were still dense, but it was more like woods now than impenetrable forest, and I was making better time. Until I heard someone, or something, in front of me. I stopped moving to listen, and whoever or whatever it was heading toward me. I climbed into an oddly shaped tree and hid myself so I could watch and see what or who was about to walk past. If it was one of those dogmen, I was going to hold my breath and hope it didn't hear or smell me. If it walked past me, I would scramble down the tree and run to the clearing. I wondered what I should do if it did indeed detect me up in the tree, and I never came to a decision about that. Because it wasn't a dogman walking toward me. It was my girlfriend. As quickly and quietly as possible, I got out of that tree and ran to her, holding my finger over my lips in the universal sign for a shh. And fortunately, she understood my meaning. We beat it back to the con where it all seemed like some sort of dream that couldn't possibly have just happened only 200 feet into the forest around a parking lot. I was kind of shaken up, so we talked about it for a while, and it turns out she never saw what I saw. She never saw anything more than what she had told me earlier, a tall man in black who might have had a mask on. That was a close enough match to what I saw that this had to be what she saw. And since two of them presented themselves to me, the possibility exists that there might have been even more than two of them in the area. So, what exactly happened? Were these creatures just coincidentally in the area engaged in activities that had nothing to do with us? Were they stalking us? If so, for what reason? Out of curiosity, or to hunt us? If they were hunting us, then why did they ignore my girlfriend and come after me in the woods? Wouldn't she have been the easier victim? Is it possible again that they surrounded me in the woods as much out of curiosity as for any other reason? I have a lot of questions about that 15 or 20 minutes of my life and very few answers. I'm not even sure what it was that I saw, obviously. I've been reading about DOGMAN lately, and I guess this was something like that. But most of the descriptions I've read do not involve creatures that were pitch black like these two were. Although I was really in the mood to get far away from there, we hung out for another 2 hours just to see if a couple in very realistic matching animatronic werewolf costumes came through the door promoting some new movie or something. Obviously, none did. So I'm left with a lot of confusion and questions, which bothered me at first. Then, one day I was telling this story to a new girlfriend, and she asked me outright if I would really want to know all the details about what those things were that I encountered on that day. I had a chill go through my entire body just at her asking me that. After reflection, I had to answer honestly that I don't think I do want to know. I mean, if someone captured a living dogman and can prove what it is, I would definitely read every article on that. But on the other hand, I have no plans to go back in the forest and try to find out for myself. The forest is the turf of the dogman, or whatever those creatures are. That's fine with me. I'll stay in the cities and the suburbs, and the dogman can stay past the tree line. As long as we both stay in our own area, everything is better for both sides. That's why these days, if I want a bit of nature, I go for a walk in the city park.
Rock'em Sock'em Dogman, as told to Peter Bernard. Read by P.Q. Ribber. This is the true story of the time I saw an actual fight between a man and a dogman. Get comfortable. I'm going to go back to the beginning now. When I was a kid in the 1970s, my parents separated, and for about a year and a half, I lived with my uncle, who I'll call Uncle Popeye for this story. He had lost one of his eyes in Vietnam, and he had a gravelly voice, but he was a former Army guy, not a sailor like the original Popeye. He had also been a boxer when he was in the service before he lost his eye. Apparently won more than he lost. I'm not sure what he supported us on, but he didn't work and never seemed short of funds. He lived very humbly in a tiny house near the Allegheny National Forest, but we ate well, and he took care of all of my needs and wants. My favorite game back then was called Rock'em Sock'em Robots. They have made sporadic comebacks now and then since the 70s. I don't know if they exist currently. It was a plastic version of a video game. You had two plastic robots in a plastic boxing ring with plastic handles on either side that you'd grip with your hands. On top of the handles were buttons you'd jam with your thumbs, which would throw either left or right punches depending which button you pushed. If you got your punch at just the right spot on the other robot's chin, his head would ride up into the air on metal gears that made a quacking sound. Your opponent would issue the traditional admission.
Oh, my block is knocked off.
That meant you won. I got my uncle to play Rock'em Sock'em Robots with me every single night, and he'd tell me stories about real-life boxing matches he'd been in, and dirty tricks that had been played on him and others in the business. He'd also give me tips on how to score more knockouts and how to be a better Rock'em Sock'em robot in general. On weekends, we'd nearly always go fishing and sometimes hunting. I was less squeamish about gutting a fish than skinning a rabbit, so I far preferred fishing to hunting. Fish seemed almost like they were put there to be eaten, but land animals all felt to me like beings with souls, and I was upset about the idea of hunting them, even though we were doing it for food and not for sport. I was obedient to my uncle, so I hunted when he wanted us to, but he understood that this was not for me. I studied fishing, though, both to get better at it and also to encourage my uncle to hunt less and fish more. Back then, one time I caught a steelhead in Lake Erie that weighed almost 16 pounds. Not a record or anything, but a good haul for a kid my age. There was one weekend that Uncle Popeye decided we were just going to hike and camp and not kill anything at all. This seemed strange for him. He liked for his leisure time to be productive, but there were some areas in the national forest nearby he loved that he wanted to show me, so we made a day of it out there, seeing some of my uncle's favorite natural areas. That night, I woke up needing to relieve myself. I prepared to leave the tent I was sharing with my uncle when I heard something or someone moving outside. It might have been a deer, but it might have been a serial killer also, and my uncle had already set down the protocol for such an occasion. I was to wake him up and let him decide what would happen next. So I roused my uncle and explained the situation to him quietly. He put his forefinger to his lips, telling me to be quiet. Then we both listened. Nothing. Maybe what I heard had left, or maybe it was just being quiet, hoping to lure us out of our tent. My uncle, not having heard the movement earlier, decided I had imagined it. I knew I had not. He decided we should walk out to the woods so I could relieve myself and he would stand guard. I told him I didn't really need to go anymore. He ignored my whining and left the tent. I ran after him. We walked from the dark clearing into the darker woods. I couldn't see anything, and neither of us wanted to use our flashlights in case there really was someone or something wandering around here. We were attempting a ninja-style bathroom trip here. The only trouble was I was absolutely terrified. I could hear crickets, frogs, birds that were maybe owls, branches, leaves, and so many other noises that I couldn't name all at once. In my utter, complete fear, my senses were wide open and receiving far more information than usual. I couldn't believe how alive the forest is at night. And I couldn't believe I had never noticed that before. Sometimes when you're literally afraid for your life, every single moment becomes remarkably interesting and wonderful. When you know you might lose something, you start to recognize its value. All I had to do was finish my duty and get back in our tent and everything would be fine. And that's what I would have done if I hadn't been so frightened that I was shaking all over. My uncle told me to hurry up. I explained to him that telling me to hurry up was making it take longer. He thought about that for a while, then suggested I imagine the sound of water running. That's when I heard running, but not water. I heard a man running toward us. Must have been a big man, because each time he landed I felt the ground shake through my feet, and each time I felt it a little harder, which meant he was running toward us. I bolted toward the tent, pulling my various wardrobe malfunctions back into place as I ran. I was crying, and I remember saying, "Oh no," or something along those lines. This was a worst-case scenario about to play itself out. Some large man was about to attack us in the pitch darkness. I dove into the tent and fished around for my flashlight. I found my uncle's first and spun around on my knees, shining the light out in the direction I had come from. I wanted to at least understand who was attacking us. What I saw made me drop the flashlight. I only saw it for a second, and it must have taken me 15 or 20 seconds to recover from what I had seen, but it'll take me a minute to describe it. My Uncle Popeye was standing there with his shirt torn, bloody scratches on his muscular arms and chest, and he was squared off in a boxing pose against a man who was even larger than the largest man I had imagined when I was listening to those footfalls running toward us. This thing had to have stood 13 feet tall if it stood an inch, and while my uncle had his hands in fists, this man held his out over his head, long fingernails faced out, as though he planned to slash at my uncle, not punch him. The tall man had nails like talons, like claws. He was the hairiest man I'd ever seen, but not furry like a cat or dog or bear. He had very dense hair, but not fur. There were patches where you could see the pink flesh underneath the hair, and there were areas in which the skin was entirely covered. It was much thicker than your average hairy man, but if a bear looked like that, I would think it must have mange. The man had a hairy head with a beard that came up around his nose and right under his eyes, nearly covering his entire face. The end of his dark pink nose was not covered by hair and seemed sort of like a pig or dog nose in that the nostrils faced directly out. The strangest thing of all was that in the split second I shone my life, I could swear that the creature had two large, long horns on its head, like the devil. This is what eventually woke me from my shock. Had I seen the devil fighting my uncle? I grabbed the flashlight and held it back on the two figures in the darkness. Those were not horns on the huge man's head. They were something even stranger. They were dog ears. Was this a mangy dog? Was this a very large, sick dog running around on its hind legs in the dark out of some sort of manic state? Had it been driven into a frenzy by something? My uncle took a few punches at the creature's body, landing each blow with ease, but not seeming to have much of an impact on the giant dog-headed monster itself. Then Uncle Popeye landed a true rock'em sock'em blast right on this hideous forest demon's chin, and actually set him back a step. Then the annoyed monster screamed. The dogman gave my uncle a backhanded slap in a bored manner and sent him flying sideways into a tree. I watched as my only means of support crumpled like Raggedy Andy, and the dogman wandered off aimlessly into the forest. I guess he forgot about me, which was just as well. It was a while before I could get up the courage to go out and see my uncle. It didn't take much to wake him up, and he was able to walk back to the tent under his own power. We spent the rest of the night in silence. By the morning, my uncle decided we were leaving. He seemed okay, although we really should have gone to the hospital to have him checked out for all manner of things, including a concussion, internal bleeding, and possible infection of all those cuts. But he was Uncle Popeye, and it was the 1970s, so we went home and moved on. One of the big changes in our life that arose out of this occurrence was that my uncle enrolled me in karate classes. He said the reason the dogman slapped him around was that he was trying to box the creature. If he had been familiar with Eastern fighting techniques, which are more useful against a larger opponent, he might have held his own longer or not gotten hit as hard. He wanted me to know how to fight larger guys than myself, and it was the dogman who inspired him to enroll me in those classes. I got sick of rock'em sock'em robots after that. My new thing was the Kung Fu TV show, starring David Carradine. Although, I don't think even David Carradine could have won a fair fight against the Dogman.
The Werewolf of Untermeyer Park. I'm sure you've heard of Untermeyer Park. It's haunted. It's used for ceremonies by cults. There have been reports of sightings of demons and Sasquatch. And every single time I went there when I was a teenager, I would see an upright walking dog-headed man. For my friends and me, going to Untermeyer Park was always an adventure, and always a dare. We had heard friend of a friend stories about people dying there, and we took them very seriously. We all felt that each time we got in my cousin's car and headed out to Untermeyer, it might be our last time ever. One time when we were there, we saw a tall man with a top hat walk past us as though he were in a trance. Some of us giggled, but he never turned to look at us. Almost every trip to the park since then, my friends would call out that they were seeing the top hat man. I would ask where, but I never saw him again. And it was sort of the opposite thing with the dogman or werewolf. When I would see him, I would sense that it was time to go, and I would insist to the others that we leave. As far as I know, none of the others would ever see the dogman, but none of them ever argued with me that he was there. We all believed what the other would say in Untermeyer Park because it seemed like basically anything could happen there. In fact, now that I think about it, the first time I ever told my friends that I had been seeing the dogman was when I told that boss character. I don't know who he was, but one night when we were sitting in the park after dark, a black car pulled up out of nowhere. We didn't have time to run away, and we should have. We should have seen and heard that car approaching for at least 30 seconds. Instead, somehow, we noticed this car pulling to a stop, and an old dude in a suit got out and walked directly up to me. He started quizzing me if I've seen the lupine something or the lupus majoris or some crap. I can't remember anymore. I said no, but we seen ghosts and we seen a werewolf. He quizzed me about the werewolf and I gave him the description. All the while my friends were completely weirded out by this, because they had never seen it and didn't know I had. After I gave the guy the description, he left. No, wait, he told me that I didn't see the werewolf and then he got in his car. I mean, like, he warned me I better act like I hadn't seen it. I don't remember if he drove off in a normal way or vanished or what, because my friends were freaking out and asking me about the dogman. So okay, here is what I would see on those nights. I would look into the woods on occasion to check for lights. The lights usually meant a bonfire or people with lit torches, in other words, cultists. All sorts of weird ceremonies were performed in those woods in those days. I'm glad that's all I know about that. So, anyway, I would be checking for lights, and then I'd see this face looking out at me from the forest, from between the trees. It was some kind of animal face, like a bear, but not a bear. The first night I ever saw him, he stepped out from the trees and I saw him in his entirety. He was taller than a man, and more muscular too. His hands ended in long claws, almost like the talons of a giant eagle. It had massive, thick legs, and yet it was a dog of some kind. A massive, terrifying-looking dog that walked around on its hind legs for some reason. That first night I saw the dog thing, I heard a voice in my head. It asked, "Do you see me?" I nodded my head yes. The voice in my head resumed. It said, "If you see me, then run." And so, since then, when I see a dogman, I run.
Dogman Mothman Battle. As told to Peter Bernard. Read by PQ River. So this story took place in 1969 when I was 7 years old. This was before my sister was born, and it was just me, my father, and my mother. Back then, in spring and summer, we would drive out to the country in Pennsylvania, park the car along the road, then make a small camp a bit further into the fields out there. It would be a different place each time, just somewhere random where nobody seemed to be around to disturb us. We would never go out of sight of the car, and sometimes you could still smell the fumes from the highway if there was traffic. This was our family's idea of roughing it. But maybe we should have stuck with that, because the one time we ventured further into nature, we encountered two Huge mystery predators, and probably could have lost our lives. Okay, 1969 is remembered as the hippie era, tie-dyed jeans and rock music and so forth. Our family was technically more like 1962. Mom and Dad looked like they stepped out of an episode of The Twilight Zone, and I suppose so did I. We were squares. So my mom made each day like a picnic, and it was very pleasant and very Ward and June Cleaver, with me starring as the Beeve. One day, Dad, and I decided we wanted to take a walk into the forest in the late morning and get back in time for Mom's lunch. I remember the trees looked nearby, but once we started walking toward them, they sure seemed much farther away than I had thought. I think maybe if you grow up in the city, sometimes distances can seem different if you're suddenly in the country with no man-made landmarks to judge by. Or maybe that place just had something weird about it. So we walked and walked and walked for long enough that my 7-year-old mind thought it was boring and was reconsidering its original decision until... What was that? We both heard it. A bird sound, but unlike any I had ever heard before. I don't think Dad knew what it was either, because he had a confused look on his face. He didn't look scared though, so I wasn't either. He just seemed curious. Now we resumed walking, but with the knowledge that there was mystery all around us, and that we'd better keep ourselves in a heightened state of awareness. It seemed like seconds till we were walking between trees and into the forest itself. From a distance, the woods looked like one thing, but as we moved in, it never seemed like we were walking into a forest. The forest still seemed off in the distance, but we were surrounded by denser foliage the more we moved forward. Then we heard that sound again. And there was a kind of flapping sound, I guess, and we heard leaves and branches moving. For just a second or two, we saw a winged, flying humanoid fly up out of the forest into the blue sky. It silhouetted itself against a white cloud, and it looked like an angel, but not a good one. I couldn't really make out the head or face, as it was backlit, and I don't know if it had arms. I know it had legs that seemed to end in long talons or claws and wings that sort of reminded me of a glider. They did not look like bird wings, but rather a stretched fabric of skin forming sails on either side. For a second I wondered if it were a man in a strange glider or a large kite, but then you could see it spotted something on the ground and changed its direction midair to pursue the item of interest. And so did we. Without even thinking about it, we both ran in the direction the bird thing had flown to. I could already hear Dad's lecture in my head that would come later, about how we must never tell Mom about what happened today. I knew we were doing something we probably would later regard as foolish. If I knew that at age 7, didn't my father also know how stupid we were being? I don't know. So, as we get closer, we heard a sound like a roar. It sounded like a threat and felt like an attack. I started crying and said I wanted to go back to my mom. Dad agreed and told me to go back to her as he ran away from me, directly toward the bellowing horror in the forest. I screamed and cried for him not to leave me there, then realized I'd better get back to my mother as fast as I could. I fell a few times on the way back. It was hard to see when I was crying, and I got very angry at myself for shaking all over. Felt like I was acting like a baby and was disappointed that I hadn't been brave like the kids you see in movies and comic books. If Batman and Robin heard a roar in the forest, would Robin start to cry and run back to his mommy? Yet, that's what I was doing. I realized I was not a hero for the first time in my young life, and I felt deeply ashamed and inadequate. When I got back to my mother, I was a complete mess for some time. She tried to get the story out of me about what had actually happened, and I tried to tell her, but it didn't make any sense. I was probably bawling pretty hard. By the time my father ran back excitedly, Mom was furious and agitated. They got into a shouting match as he told us he saw the giant bird have a blood battle with a hairy giant man who had a head like a shaggy horse with a dog-like mouth full of dagger-length fangs. Dad and I both packed up, or really Dad did, and wow, was Mom angry about her picnic being ruined. She felt it was just a bear and that he was scaring me and her both and that he needed to see a psychiatrist and all this sort of thing. They were arguing in an adult way. I would only pick up parts that I understood from their previous arguments. I just wanted to understand more about this dog-headed horse-faced man that my father saw and what the battle was about. Who won? What did winning actually mean in a case like that? This was the most fascinating thing that could happen to a 7-year-old kid in those days, and to be completely honest, I'm in my 50s now, and I've never had anything nearly as interesting as that ever happen to me again. But my mother told us both to shut up and said my father was scaring me. She had him go start the car while she packed up and we got out of there, never speaking of it again that day. I had to wait till the next night before my dad and I could get some alone time out of my mother's notice. Finally, I could hear what had happened in the woods after I had run away. Okay. So, my father said he came into a clearing in the woods, and there was a terrible racket of screams and fighting. He said he saw, in the middle of this clearing, the large bird thing, now bleeding and scratched up, savagely fighting the aforementioned dog-horse man. It appeared they were battling over either prey or something they had scavenged. He really couldn't see from his angle. I asked him to describe the monsters with more detail. He said the flying creature flew in an odd, almost mechanical way. It was more like he was able to float quickly in different directions. Its wings would only occasionally change positions, making a flapping sound each time. But they did not actually flap, and Dad could not tell how it stayed in the air. Yet it was able to maneuver through some means, and it attacked the other animal with its claws on its legs as it floated in front of and over the creature. The land-based animal seemed kind of like a wolf man, but its head and neck reminded him of a horse somehow. It had the effect of a mane, like a horse on top of its head, but it was shaggier than a horse, more like a canine in that sense. It had arms and legs like a man, though from what my father was able to see from his angle, he said the creature fought using its front claws and by biting, snapping at the bird monster like a shark trying to take a bite out of you. Although both animals seemed completely unearthly and unnatural, they were injuring each other with their attacks and both bleeding and a bit hobbled from the effort. Then, my father said, as the bat-bird man tried to fly over the horse-faced dog man, the werewolf creature grabbed the other by its legs and swung it in an arc straight into a large tree. The flying creature went limp, and the dogman held it over its head like a rag doll, then screamed in triumph. Realizing that the ferocious dog-horse monster now had free time on its clawed hands to do further damage, my father finally decided it might be time to leave. And you know the rest of the story. Looking back on it, I find it hard to believe that this is an actual memory from my childhood, but it definitely was. My mother, to the day she died, insisted my father saw a bird and a dog fight over some food, and he blew it up into something bigger. But she never denied that a strange event took place on that day, or that my father said it was a horse-headed dog that walked on its hind legs versus a giant Batman. My dad died in 1980, so even though he and I talked about it many times after the event, my memories of those conversations are themselves ancient. As for where this all took place, it had to have been in Pennsylvania, somewhere. And that's about all I would know, some rural part of Pennsylvania. I always expected as I grew up that some explanation would emerge about these creatures, and that we would all know about flying bat-winged glider monsters and dogs that walk like people by the time I was 30 or 40. Instead, the older I got, the stranger and more impossible the story seemed. Were these creatures real or something out of a dream or nightmare? Does the forest itself dream out loud and make these things happen? How could animals like these be seen one time and never again? I've read a lot of Fortean and cryptozoological writing over the years, and there are other reports of similar things now and then, but in each case there seem to be differences that are as confusing as the similarities. There are so many different kinds of bat-winged humanoids reported that it would seem that the Earth is inhabited by 7 or 9 different species of them. That's just not possible. The same for dog-headed creatures. The Jersey Devil is supposed to have a horse head, and Pennsylvania is next to New Jersey. Yet the Jersey Devil is supposed to have wings, and it was the other creature my father saw who had wings, not the horse-headed Dogman. To think these are natural creatures that normally inhabit the Earth seems utterly insane to me, even though I actually saw the flying bat humanoid, and it looked like a natural living creature to me. It seems almost like these cryptids are nature combining with imagination in some unknown way and for some unknown reason. Another idea I sometimes have is the idea that maybe these creatures come from underground somewhere, or from a parallel reality coexisting with ours. There may be an infinite number of parallel realities, thus possibly explaining the many different variations of these things. All I know is, if you venture into nature, there is no guidebook that will ever be written that will be able to warn you of all the high strangeness that you could potentially encounter. I don't think we should be afraid of the wilderness. I think we should cherish it and be in awe of it. And of all the creatures nature chooses to inhabit herself with, even Dogman.
Werewolf of the Cemetery. My family recently bought a house in a quaint town in upstate New York. We were told that we were also buying this small graveyard that was directly connected to our property. Even though the cemetery technically belonged to us, we still had to keep it open to the public during daylight hours. The most recent burial in that yard occurred in 1859, so we never got surviving relatives visiting. About the only visitor I ever remember seeing among the gravestones was the strange old werewolf I would see there in the middle of the night. I say old because this long-haired beast had gray among his darker fur, not white, but silver. He was not albino, he was just aging. I call him a werewolf because that comes closest to describing his appearance, although I never saw any movie or illustrated werewolf that looked anything like this creature. I would see this thing in the middle of the night as I would get up to use the restroom. One of my bedroom windows overlooked the graveyard, and sometimes this figure would be standing there, staring up in the sky. The most recent time I saw him was at the end of February, and I think that night that he was staring at the moon. I've never heard the animal make a sound. I said before that this whatever it was didn't resemble anything I'd ever seen before, whether in reality or fiction. I'd attempt to describe it, but I'm not sure how clear I can be in this case. I would say that this was a very large and extremely deformed man, except that its tall ears on top of its head were purely formed. They pointed in different directions, constantly moving and hearing things my human ears would never hear. Most times when I see him, the ears are the only part of him that's moving, except maybe his fur blowing in the late night breeze. Underneath the lovely tall dog ears on top of its head, there's nothing but nightmare. This is the face of a monster. This thing has thick, heavy eyebrows, a unibrow really, and these thick, shaggy brows hang down low over two furious-looking eyeballs. It has a nose more like a dog than like an ape, but its lips under the nose were not split like the upper lip of a dog or a cat. It looks like the mouth of an ape under the nose of a dog. I do not know what its teeth are like, as I've never seen it open its mouth. Another odd thing about this is that I have never seen the monster arrive, and I have never seen it leave. I have not heard of anyone else seeing the thing, even though 2 other houses are positioned so that they could possibly get views of the location in question. There are only 2 entrances to this small cemetery, and the chain-link fence which completely surrounds it. One gate is on the street and usually kept open. The other is on my property, allowing one to go from our backyard to the cemetery. The fence is at least 5 feet tall all the way around, and the brick wall behind it must be at least 7 feet tall. There is some forest past the house behind the brick wall, but it's not like this monster could have wandered from the woods into the graveyard. If I was witnessing a natural animal, then I have no real explanation of how it could have arrived there, or where it could have come from. This leads me to consider 2 possibilities. One is that I might be experiencing hypnagogic hallucinations of this creature. In other words, it might not be down in the cemetery at all, but might be only in my head. Maybe I'm projecting the image or idea of the werewolf down there into the graveyard. The other possibility that pops into my mind is that maybe the creature is not natural, but rather some form of apparition, tied to that location in some way we cannot understand. In any case, I see a hairy, tall, mutated-looking man who looks like he's half dog, standing in the cemetery beneath my bedroom window at night, and it terrifies me. Update. As I was proofreading this to send to you, my neighbor sent me a bit of news I had previously been unaware of. I had been wondering why this cemetery was not adjacent to any church. It seemed so odd for it to be on private ground, especially as we are not in a rural area, but a suburban one. I must have made a comment to that effect to her in an email, and she just wrote me back that the church used to be located where my house currently stands. It seems the church burned down and nobody alive claimed relation to any of the people buried in the yard. The town finally allowed a man to build his residence on the old church property if he took on the responsibility of the cemetery's upkeep. This is why we inherited this obligation. Now that I know that our house is on what was once considered holy ground, I feel more certain that the visions I had of the Dogman must have been paranormal in nature. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the Dogman I've been seeing is of an evil or demonic nature. Maybe he's here in a loyal way. Maybe he's the guardian of the graveyard. The ancient Egyptians depicted the guardian of the land of the dead as Anubis, who is shown as a man with a dog's head. I was taught in school that this was meant as metaphor. Maybe it was that, and maybe it was something more literal at the same time.
I saw a fox turn into a dogman, as told to Peter Bernard, read by P.Q. Ribber. This here is a story that happened in 1997 when I was 18. It was springtime, and I was feeling it. All I was interested in that year was girls. Some of my girlfriend's parents referred to me as a wolf, but in actuality, my teenage fascination with girls led to me crossing paths with a real-life werewolf. Okay, spring, warm, free time, wandering around town, looking in stores but trying not to buy anything. bam, there she is. And our story can get started. There was this girl in this store. She was the most stunning girl my teenage eyes had yet beheld. Even at the time, I could not comprehend her appeal. She was dressed like she had come home from work, but in some way she seemed done up fully. I don't understand the things that women do. Maybe it was her makeup or her hair or her way of standing and moving, but everything about her spoke loudly to me. It said, "I'm too good for you," in the deep male voice of her father or boyfriend. A girl like this was not single, and she almost certainly dated someone with a job. That was the thing that annoyed me the most about pretty girls back then, but still, somewhere in the back of my mind, I wished I deserved a girl like that. I never really had a dream or vision of the perfect life for myself before, but now, suddenly I did. It was me figuring out how to be the kind of guy that went out with someone like her. When she left the store, I noticed she was going in the same direction I was going to go in, so naturally I walked after her. I mean, not after her, just in the same direction. By coincidence. After a few blocks, she turned left. I don't usually turn left for another block, but it was such a beautiful spring day, and I was a teenage boy, mesmerized by a young lady in a tight skirt walking home from work. There was a much lower likelihood of having such an exquisite view on the next block as on this one. Anyway, she made an odd choice at the end of the street, turning right instead of going left or forward. On the right over there is just a lot leading to trees that lead into the natural area. Why would she be going there? I stood and watched her. I was confused. She entered into some trees, and it dawned on me that I knew a shortcut past the trees into the clearing. I ran so that I could reach the meadow before she did. Maybe in there I could get up the courage to talk to her. I reached my destination and tried to pant quietly, catching my breath and trying to look cool in case the girl walked by. I saw no one there. Peeking out from behind a tree and looking to my right in the direction I would expect her to emerge from the woods, I saw nothing. Then, quietly, I heard branches breaking. She was coming. Adrenaline flowed through me, and I decided to go for it. I would walk casually in her direction and casually strike up a casual conversation. Casually. As I rounded the patch of trees I could hear her on the other side of, I saw something I did not expect to see. It was not the pretty girl with the perfect makeup and cute outfit I had seen go into the woods. It was a haint. It was a booger. It was a giant monster. It was like a demon dog, but it stood on its hind legs like the devil and had claws like some kind of giant hairy lizard, if such a thing could exist. Its ears and nose were like a dog or a wolf, but a primitive caveman kind of wolf with ridiculously long teeth. Its eyes looked like those of an insane thing, like it was terrified or furious, and I couldn't tell which. It looked like it was overwhelmed and horrified as it saw me there, no longer looking so casual. I'm pretty sure I screamed like a girl, and I know I ran out of there back toward the bus I should have already taken back home. I was crying. What a Casanova. The thing lumbered after me, swishing through bushes and cracking down trees, moving like the wind itself. When it would land, it would cause the ground to vibrate so hard that my feet would bounce off the ground. I was weeping. It was going to catch up to me, and whatever happened next was not going to be any fun at all. When I got free of the trees, I could see the bus heading towards its stop. I kept running at top speed. I might be able to make it. I raced frantically, wide-eyed toward the road. Behind me, the monster thing roared. It felt like someone had kicked me in the back. The world looked like I was seeing it through jello, and it all vibrated with every footstep I took and every footstep the monster behind me took. I reached the road and never saw the car to my left heading right toward me. I heard it beeping, but it was too late. I was committed to crossing that road and catching that bus. If I didn't, I was dead anyway. So I ignored the impending death, represented by the speeding car to my left, and continued running across the street. I felt the wind and heard the screech behind me. Then I heard the impact as the car met DOGMAN. Fortunately, the bus driver noticed none of this. I boarded, he drove off, and I took a seat, watching the car accident I had inadvertently helped cause as we rolled out of there. The people in the car seemed okay, which was a huge relief. Unfortunately, I saw the DOGMAN, who also was still alive. And it was looking right at me. The creature started jogging after us, and I prayed for the driver to speed up. I prayed there would be nobody at the next stop and that we wouldn't pull over or open the doors until I was home. I looked back at the werewolf thing. It dropped to all fours and was now running, much faster. In fact, it caught up with the bus, looked at me up in my window. I was crying looking back at it. I wondered what it would do. Then it surprised me by turning off into the woods and running away. It was gone. I felt the hugest sense of relief I think I had yet felt in my young life up to that point. I couldn't think of any way to defeat this creature. Then it just got bored of chasing me, and it was like, problem solved. Life could be good sometimes. So then I looked forward and to the right down the road. There, at the next bus stop, sitting there wearing the same cute outfit and the same sweet makeup and same everything, was that girl. The girl I had seen walking into the woods. At first I was glad to see her, but then I realized there was no way she could have gotten to that stop from where I last saw her in that amount of time. Unless... So, as she got on the front of the bus, I exited from the rear door. I knew a shortcut from this stop back to my neighborhood. She would be on that bus for at least 4 or 5 minutes before she reached the next stop, so I had a head start. I knew she was the werewolf. She was the DOGMAN. She knew I knew, and so now she would stalk me. I got home safely that day, but I became increasingly paranoid about going out and even more about coming home. I got to be like the Will Smith character in I Am Legend, wanting to get home before dark and not seen by that whatever it was. It forced me to get serious about things, and I decided to go away to college. It's not the reason I told my parents that I wanted to attend school in a different state, but it's the real behind-the-scenes reason. I just don't ever want to run into that girl ever again. And I hope that from now till the day I die, that I never see a DOGMAN ever again.
Come back for more scary stories.